Hi, here I want to talk about an interview given by Anders Tegnell, the Swedish chief or state epidemiologist who was interviewed by France 24. In the new media, the Swedish model is highly praised, but I wanted to mention that Anders worked for the WHO to create a vaccination program before when he was head of the infectious disease control department in Sweden, and he played a key role in the Swedish large-scale vaccination program for the swine flu in 2009. So 3 billion doses were produced and delivered in 2009. But it turned out that in Scandinavia, there was a 4 times higher case number of narcolepsy, as it's a long-term neurological disease of the deep wake cycle. And so there was eventually a vaccination recall. And if you remember, then after this failed pandemic of the swine flu, the WHO changed the definition of a pandemic, requiring not any more substantial death to define and call a pandemic. In 2013, Anders became the state epidemiologist of Sweden. So you see there's already quite a mixed background in terms of Sweden's and Anders' attitude towards vaccinations. And based on this failed vaccination program, it's not like he lost his job. He basically became promoted. But you also notice here in the background, there's a bunch of statements about sustained development. This sounds very much like UN agenda. So it's not like Sweden is completely alternative medicine. On the contrary. The interview is interesting because it sends a lot of mixed messages, confusing messages, I think. And it potentially is an example of that politics and medicine is not like a 2D chess game where two opponents play with open cards and make their best moves. Scenarios like that are often described as 5D chess, that's their hidden agendas, and you see only the tip of an iceberg. You don't see the full picture in an interview like that. You don't know what parts are staged, what instructions everyone received. Okay, let's take a look.
Today we are in Sweden, in Stockholm, and our guest is Dr. Anders Tegnell. Hello. You are Sweden's chief epidemiologist. You are the architect of Sweden's very own, very specific approach to the COVID-19 crisis. The first question I'd like to ask you is, how is this strategy going at the moment?
I think at the moment we are very happy with the strategy. The number of cases has fallen in Sweden during the last couple of months. We're now down to very low levels. Lower levels than most countries in Europe actually right now. Our mortality has gone down to almost zero. We have very few cases in intensive care and almost no cases in our hospitals anymore. So right now...
See already a lot of things. So the interviewer calls Tegnell a guest. Of course, you could see it from the perspective of the news agency like that. But the fact is that the interviewer is a guest in Sweden. We also notice that the interviewer has a much more calm demeanor and he has a much better seat. What I mean by that, Anders Tegnell also he has a home advantage. He's sitting in this tight chair with a high armrest. It's very difficult not to feel claustrophobic sitting in a chair like that. And if you put your arms on the armrest, you immediately get into this turtling position. You can't help it essentially. And the idea is when you put your body in a position that affects your mind, even so originally you wouldn't have sat like that. The turtling position generally means that you're uncomfortable with the situation and that you try to duck down, that you would like to escape. And this is further confirmed by Anders' head being as far back as possible. And it's that far back actually that he has difficulty even to speak. If you try to do that, put your chin back, it's very hard to speak like that. With the raised shoulders, it's very hard to breathe and talk. So he's stuck in this little seat. Also, it's his town. So he's not using the home advantage. And he looks particularly weak in this position. Another thing which doesn't help him really, he has this macro expression of disgust, like he's smelling something bad, and also he has the right side of his mouth go down. So this is a very dismissive, negative expression on his face. Originally, this likely was a micro expression which got carved in his face and became a macro expression. So he can't do anything about this right now in this interview, but it tells you something about his character. And he fiddles around with his thumb. There's some stress and he tries to dissipate the stress, but we don't see this with the other guy.
We're quite happy. And we are heading into the fall with some...
So you see the chin is far back and it's really hard to speak like that. Also, it's something what he seems to be doing a lot in interviews.
Confidence.
So you see, you're heading into the fall with some confidence. It's true that the figures of new cases per day are extremely low in the country, around a 20th of what we have in France, for example, or other European countries. Do you think that is something that is going to be sustained, that it is going to carry on like that?
I think we are reasonably confident that it can be sustained because we are building this on the same kind of strategy that we'll be using all through this pandemic, trying to get people to stay at home when they're sick, working from home as much as possible.
So two things I notice. He's an expert, but he doesn't use the knowledge to correct the interviewer. Here's a confusion again about cases. So a lot of cases, of course, doesn't mean anything. It's based on this very sensitive PCR tests with a high number of false positives. So when you test people in summer, when there's very little viral load going around, like any summer, in summers you don't have a flu season, for instance, because any virus is immediately killed by UV sunlight, and you start testing massively, you get just false positives. And these false positives don't mean infected people or sick people. He could correct the interviewer using his knowledge, and I'm sure he knows all that, but he doesn't do it, which is slightly odd. He plays along.
We're keeping distance in the society, and that staying with the same strategy means that we can keep on having this strategy also through the fall. And since that strategy has served us reasonably well so far,
So he's massaging his hand with his thumb. So stressed.
we also think that it can serve us well during this fall.
The figures are around, 100, 120 new cases per day.
So the guy talks about figures and cases, no clue whatsoever about anything, but he seems confident.
On average, we'd say it gets as low as 60 some days.
And Anders Tegnell nods, so he's agreeing about the cases, which is very inaccurate.
As high as 180 some days. Do you think you're going to see the same figures, or do you think there might be a spike? Because we are seeing a spike in the southern Europe.
Yeah, I think what we are calculating is going to happen this fall is that we're going to have local outbreaks, like they've seen in Norway, like they've seen in...
So two things, local outbreaks, of course they were also in Germany and other countries, but these were again because of intensive testing, so mostly false positives. And this was a lot in these meat production companies, and there's a suspicion that the governments try to shut down meat production and food production following their sinister plans. So he's playing along with this. Again, he's not correcting. On the positive side, he's going back and forth with his head, left and right, wobbling around. So he's someone who is pondering and looking at both sides.
Germany, in specific locations, special working places, something like that. That's what we are most concerned about, and that's what we are really building.
So he's
preparedness
playing along.
To deal with those as quickly as possible.
As you know, of course, the strategy here that you have implemented is very criticized because it is different from what's been done in other countries.
It was
You're
a
not
smile.
forced to lock down. You're not forcing people to work.
So there was a smug smile, effectively making fun of the Swedish approach, belittling it.
Wear masks on the streets, for example, as it is the case in other countries now and the rest of Europe.
The masks on the street are the dumbest thing not founded on any science whatsoever.
Why did you choose this strategy? Can you explain it? Why not?
Of course, these are very dumb questions, but whatever, let's keep going.
Choose to lock down or to wear the face masks?
Because this is very much in the strategy and in the tradition of the public health work, and that's why we started with this kind of voluntary strategy.
It's very dismissive, the facial expression, and even disgust and even contempt, but it's about his characters. These are macro expressions.
Giving a lot of influence to the population, giving them a lot of responsibility, the same way we do in many other areas. We managed to keep our healthcare system running.
He's still fiddling around, he's super nervous. I don't know it's about this interview or if he's always like that.
Especially since we know that closing down society will have a lot of negative effects on public health in many other areas.
At least he mentions that. Very good.
This strategy has had a cost in human lives. I'm thinking of all the Swedes. You have pretty much, on average, around 10 times the mortality rates.
Yes, he's playing the guilt card. I saw many studies now which showed no correlation between lockdown measures and numbers of deaths. So
no, there's not complete connection to that because you can look at countries like Belgium, Netherlands, and France who have similar mortality rates compared to Sweden.
Okay, so here he's setting that record straight.
Our mortality rate has been very low for several months already.
So there was an excess death, and then now there's less death than the average. So there was no net increase in mortality compared to any other year.
So there is definitely not a close connection between the strategy and the mortality rate. This was very much due to a high level of mortality in our elderly homes, long-term care facilities.
So there was an issue that Sweden very early on sent home old infected people from the hospital back to their care homes, which apparently led to some high number of deaths early on. But there was this mistake made in the beginning, this carelessness.
You're saying nothing has gone wrong. I mean, there are 5,800.
So of course something went wrong.
So again, the interviewer plays a guilt card, and Anders Tegnell doesn't correct that here. The number of deaths still is based on the fact that anyone who died with a positive test is counted as a corona death.
As far as this strategy, it is different from the rest of the world. For example, face masks.
Again, smug face, and again, the unscientific face masks.
For you, face masks don't need to be made mandatory in Sweden.
No, first of all, we don't use mandatory for many things in public health in Sweden.
But you don't even recommend them. You don't even recommend wearing face masks.
Right now.
Here, Anders could cite some literature which show how harmful face masks are for the average population or children, but he doesn't do it.
The evidence is very weak for the effect, and if there is effect, it's probably not very big.
Here he at least mentions that.
The best measures is to have a social distancing, stay at home when you're sick, and trying to work from home. Those measures are definitely a lot more effective than face masks.
So in Sweden there's a 50-person limit for assemblies. That's also why teaching is mostly remote. So there are some measures actually implemented. And when you look at a university website, it mentions social distancing, there are pictures of the signs, and there's a lot of COVID-19 research as well. So it is not that different, in fact. Also, people on the street are effectively free to do whatever they like.
And the choices you've made have been criticized. By doctors all over the world. And
again, smug, and again rubbing it in. Of course, criticized only by always the same doctors funded by Big Pharma.
Including here in Sweden.
But these are very vague statements.
What was the goal when you said, right, I don't know, the rest of Europe is locking down, we're not locking down. Now the rest of Europe is saying we're going to wear face masks, and you say there's no need for it. Do you think Sweden has got over the hump? Do you think it's over here?
No, it's not over for anybody. This is a disease that's going to be with us for a long time, and we're going to have to adapt to it in different ways.
He's playing along with the narrative, and that this disease is sticking with us, and of course this is what is promoted everywhere else in the world to prepare for the bloody vaccine. So to summarize, Anders Tegnell, he's not correcting the interviewer a lot. Also, he mentions sometimes that face masks are not based on a lot of evidence and so on. But he's not going in the offensive. He could be criticizing the measures in the rest of the world and correcting for the fact that cases are not infected people. And he must know all that. In particular, he plays down the Swedish strategy, like being nothing special or not so different from the other ones. So there are different ways now to interpret all this. So one reason could be that he really doesn't want to draw any attention to Sweden, and that's supported by his turtling, by equalization with the rest of the countries in terms of lockdown. Also it was voluntary, maybe in hopes that they stop attacking Sweden. It might also be because of some sort of survivor's guilt, in some sense stand out too much and feel guilty about it. However, it could also be part of a plan that he's still following the vaccination agenda, but because of the failed vaccination program in 2009, and because the Swedish people generally have more responsibility, that there was no chance now to implement a lockdown in Sweden, and instead that a strategy was followed that sick people from hospitals, old people were sent back to care homes to cause a much higher mortality rate in Sweden compared to some other countries, at least initially, and by doing so to show the Swedish population that the strategy went wrong, and then that they have to catch up with other countries in terms of more severe lockdown measures. However, the Swedish model now was considered a great success by many, and so the question is how to continue here. And one way to continue would be to make Sweden look relatively weak and not confident at all. And this could be already designed by the setup with the chairs, the turtling. He doesn't look very confident. he looks cornered, and this is essentially on purpose already. Instead, in the long run, Swedish will catch up with the other countries and follow the UN agenda, the Great Reset, and all the other globalist measures which are coming our way. Of course, here I'm just speculating. I'm just wondering why he doesn't show more confidence and correct other countries for the disastrous lockdown measures and doesn't cite more scientific facts. Okay, so I hope this was a useful analysis, and talk to you next time. Bye.